I start on the paper, I'd just like to express my gratitude to all of you for being here. It's almost certainly true that I'm the only one who's guaranteed to be interested in every one of the papers that was delivered. Other people could be interested in this one more than the other one. I feel like it was all put on just for my benefit. And I've learned a lot from it. It's very stimulating. I appreciate it. I'd especially like to thank the organizers of the conference. They selflessly didn't put themselves on the program. Some of them did tutorials, but they didn't permit themselves to do proper papers. When they saw what wonderful papers came in the call for papers, they just graciously and generously stepped back and didn't put themselves on the program. And that's a very special thing. I appreciate it. I hope we all do. And I particularly want to thank you, Carl. This has been wonderfully organized. It's a wonderful event, and you've really made this happen. I very much appreciate it. I'm going to talk about metaphysics, and may bore you to tears because Elena gave a wonderful summary of the views that I'm going to express, including picking out some of the choice nuggets in quotations already. So I hope somewhere along the way filling in the details is of some use. One constant in Wittgenstein's thought, early and late, is a denial of metaphysical naturalism, but also a denial of what we might call methodologically monistic scientism, by which I mean a broadly epistemological view that's often taken to be a consequence of metaphysical naturalism. And this is the claim, roughly, that scientific knowledge is the form of knowledge, and scientific understanding is the only kind of understanding that deserves the name. I mentioned in passing, I think it's important to distinguish this very strong methodological claim from the weaker, but already substantially committed claim, usually called the scientia mensura, of Sellers, who says, in the dimension of describing and explaining the world, science is the measure of all things, of those that are, of what is that it is, and of what is not that it is not. That's a committed claim. And what I'm calling methodologically monistic scientism is much stronger. For one thing, Sellers is restricting the authority of science to the dimension of describing and explaining. He's explicitly not including the normative in that, whereas the monistic scientism says the only kind of understanding there is scientific understanding. Philosophy is not one of the natural sciences, Wittgenstein says in the Tractatus. And that view seems to be one of the things that lies behind the theoretical quietism of his later work. I think Wittgenstein thinks that if systematic philosophical theorizing were possible, it would mean that philosophy is an empirical science. And since he thinks it's not, philosophers, he thinks, have to eschew theorizing and restrict themselves instead to light local descriptions of discursive practices, where such descriptions might provide helpful reminders in freeing ourselves from the sorts of misunderstandings and puzzlements that arise precisely from the theories, implicit and inherited pictures of what's going on when we think and talk. And whether or not Wittgenstein himself reasoned in this way, I take it it's at least common for his admirers to see him as presenting us with a forced choice. Either embrace scientism of that philosophy, of that methodologically monistic sort, that is, take philosophy to be an empirical scientific discipline, or give up the idea of systematic philosophical theorizing once and for all. I think that's a false choice. Rejecting scientism of the methodologically monist sort doesn't entail giving up the possibility of systematic philosophical theorizing about discursive practice. One of the most powerful methodological features of natural science is the postulation of unobservable theoretical entities, and their deployment in constructions aimed at explaining what is observable. Theoretical entities are those about which we can make only theoretical, not observational claims. And theoretical claims are ones we can only become entitled to as the conclusions of inferences from other claims, not non-inferentially, as the result of exercising reliable dispositions to respond to environing states of affairs by making observational reports of them. A generalization of this method, postulation of unobservables, would have the role played by observational vocabulary, played by any antecedently available vocabulary, whether observational or not. So, for instance, one might postulate meanings to explain proprieties of use, where the latter are expressed in a non-semantic vocabulary, whether or not our access to the claims about correct usage are made observationally or themselves inferentially. This is actually a point I think Dummett was confused about for many years, thinking properly that the role of meanings was to explain use. He insisted that the only semantic things, the only meanings we could talk about, had to actually be aspects of use. But that's precisely to be some sort of semantic instrumentalist, not to allow us to postulate things not definable in terms of use, but which we could use then to explain use. The claim that theorizing of this sort could be legitimate in philosophy does not come in under the claim that this method is the only legitimate method of acquiring philosophical understanding, which is what methodological humanistic scientism claims. The generalized method of postulation and construction might be one form of philosophical understanding among others. I want to claim that what's objectionable about the methodologically humanistic form of scientism is its exclusivity. Rejecting that at least leaves open the question of whether and which features of natural scientific investigation, explanation, knowledge, and understanding ought also to be counted among those useful and appropriate in philosophy. After all, description is also a central and essential element of scientific methodology, and even the most rigorous versions of Wittgensteinian quietism allow philosophers to describe features of our linguistic practice. One reason to be skeptical is provided by a positive view that's something like the converse of methodologically humanistic scientism, and which is also often associated with the later Wittgenstein, though not exclusively with him. And that is that the subject matter itself settles that discursive practices, the capacity to use and deploy vocabularies, requires a distinctive kind of understanding. The reason we should not be methodological monists is that understanding talking and thinking, concept use, vocabularies, natural language utterances, and texts is a distinctive sort of achievement. This kind of understanding, which we might call hermeneutic understanding, is not expressible in explicit rules, formalizable in regimented technical or artificial languages. The mathematized and mature natural sciences have had great success in achieving what we might call algebraic understanding of great swaths of the inanimate natural world. But the thought goes, when the topic is culture rather than nature, another sort of approach is called for. Here, the paradigm of understanding is that exhibited by competent native speakers of natural languages when confronted by everyday utterances expressed in familiar vocabulary. This sort of practical grasp of meanings, the medium of the cultural, is not, in most fundamental cases, a matter of explicit theorizing at all. And it's not a matter of mapping or translating the utterance into some other vocabulary, perhaps with the auxiliary use of logical vocabulary. In the sense that matters for this point, the language of my thought just is my language, the language I speak. More sophisticated forms of hermeneutic understanding, of the sort exercised by literary critics, jurisprudential interpreters, and readers of philosophical texts, are possible, but they're both rooted in the basic one and do not come closer to having the structure of algebraic understanding. A pragmatist line of thought, common to the Dewey of experience in nature and art and experience, the Heidegger of being and time, and the Wittgenstein of the philosophical investigations, is that there is such a thing as hermeneutic understanding in this sense. It is a genuine and distinctive kind of understanding, and it's the most basic kind of understanding, in the sense that all the other sorts of understanding are parasitic on it and develop out of it. It's the primordial sort of practical discursive know-how, the capacity to engage in an autonomous discursive practice. In particular, this line of thought is concerned to insist that the sort of algebraic understanding characteristic of mature mathematized sciences, the sort for which analytic philosophers traditionally long, is pragmatically dependent on everyday hermeneutic understanding, which accordingly cannot be replaced or reduced to the more technical kind. Now, I accept all these pragmatist claims about the distinctiveness and basicness of ordinary hermeneutic understanding of discursive performances and their products. But this pragmatist line of thought does not entail that many aspects of discursive practice might not also be susceptible to understanding of the sort I've called algebraic. And where it is possible, broadly algebraic understanding has distinctive virtues, which adherents of the project of analysis are right to esteem and to treasure. The slogan of the analytic project is faith, hope, and clarity, and the greatest of these is clarity. The clarity in question is specifically conceptual clarity. It would seem to have two dimensions, definiteness and perspicuity. From a pragmatic point of view, the significance of a speech act is definite insofar as its normative significance is settled. From the point of view of semantic inferentialism, this means that concepts are definite insofar as their circumstances and consequences of application are settled, when one is committed and entitled to apply them, and what such application commits and entitles one to. Perspicuity is then epistemic or psychological ease of access to those circumstances and consequences of application. On this line, thinking clearly is both formulating one's claims so as to fix what one would be committing oneself to by endorsing them, and what would entitle one to do so, and being aware of those definite consequences and circumstances of application of the concepts that articulate the contents of the concepts one is applying. Writing clearly, then, is choosing one's words so as both to determine the inferential boundaries of one's claims and to convey them to the reader. What I'm calling the algebraic form of understanding achieves clarity along both dimensions of definiteness and perspicuity by constructing the conceptual contents expressed by a target vocabulary. It does that by exhibiting them as complexes, formed as products of applying explicit algorithms to the conceptual contents expressed by a base vocabulary, treated for this purpose and relative to this construction as simple. What corresponds in this semantic analytic project to the postulation of unobservables in empirical scientific theorizing is the employment in the algorithmic construction of some further auxiliary vocabulary, whose use is not governed by antecedent norms, but is determined instead by stipulated inferential connections to both base and target vocabulary. This algorithmic constructional method, building complex things by applying well-defined operations to simpler things, is a very good, perhaps superlative way of achieving clarity of understanding. I've elsewhere called it, for this reason, the gold standard of understanding generally, by which I mean that when and to the extent that it's available, it's the very best sort of understanding to have. For it takes the issue of what one needs, what one is committed to by a claim, what's incompatible with it, what would count as evidence for or against it, and so on, out of the hands, out from under the authority of the one making the claims. It establishes a fact of the matter about the inferential relations that articulate the contents of the concepts expressed by the target vocabulary, that swings free of the beliefs and preferences of the concept user, what she would like to be committed to or treat as evidence for those claims. If a dispute arises, those who are assessing the claim in question can say with Leibniz, "Let us calculate." This aspiration to develop what he called, quote, a general method in which all truths of reason would be reduced to a kind of calculation, and errors except those of fact would be mere mistakes in calculation, end of quote. I take it here that his truths of reason stand for the inferential relations that articulate the contents of the concepts involved. That aspiration is one of the reasons Leibniz was a hero for Russell in the latter's attempt to develop a notion of philosophical analysis. This sort of clarity of understanding is a pearl without price, all the more to be prized where the target vocabulary it concerns is weightier and more difficult, as is the case with many of those either used by or addressed by philosophers. Appreciating this cardinal virtue of the algebraic form of understanding does not require taking issue with the pragmatist point that it is in principle parasitical and intelligible in principle only against the background of the more basic sort of practical discursive understanding that does not at all have this explicit theoretical form. It's useless, for instance, in settling disputes about what someone is committed to by a claim couched in the target vocabulary being reconstructed, unless there's a shared base vocabulary about whose proper use all parties can agree in practice. We're not in a position to calculate at the other end of the metaphor unless we can all practically go on the same way in counting and adding, as Wittgenstein is at pains to remind us in many different ways in many different contexts. And the same is true of algebraically computing the inferential rules or truth conditions of complex expressions from those of simpler ones. Algorithmic elaboration is a way of leveraging practical agreement on the use of one vocabulary into practical agreement in the use of another. It's true that what plays the role of a base vocabulary for one such constructive enterprise may be the target vocabulary, whose proper use is algorithmically reconstructed by another. But the point Wittgenstein was after here is that it cannot be algorithmic elaboration all the way down. At some point, each such chain must be anchored in practical agreement about what it is and is not correct to do with the vocabulary that's not settled by being algorithmically handed off to some prior one. And that's to say, we should not make the jump from the legitimate local aspiration to be able to settle some semantic inferential disputes in the calculemos way to Leibniz's dream of a global lingua characteristic, all of whose concepts are governed by a calculus ratio senator that is, in this sense, universal. Acknowledging the value of the unique clarity afforded by algebraic understanding accordingly does not entail commitment to that sort of understanding being available in every case, even in principle. It does not oblige us to embrace the shaky method of the drunk who looks for his keys under the street lamp, not because they're likely to be there, but just as the light is better. We should admit that sometimes algebraic understanding is not available, and indeed that every context in which it is available contains an appeal to a base vocabulary whose use is not held in place algebraically, but depends on another sort of practical mastery and understanding. Algebraic understanding can be no more legitimate than the hermeneutic understanding on which it depends, and which it leverages, amplifies, and concentrates. It follows that philosophy cannot be identified with analysis, thought of as comprising the tasks of understanding algebraic understanding and applying it in semantics. Even under the broad heading of trying to understand discursive practice, there's a more basic sort of hermeneutic understanding, both whose implicit, practical, everyday species and whose explicit, theoretical, sophisticated species must both be studied and exercised by philosophers. Thinking through the presuppositions of its project shows that analytic philosophy can aspire at most to being one species of a genus. So there is then a lot more to be understood about discursiveness than can be understood algebraically. That's obviously true de facto, and I've just rehearsed an argument that is also true de jure. But can we know in advance that the algebraic sort of understanding is not available for some subject matters? Might it not be the case that the very nature of discursive practice makes it unsuitable for this sort of account? Perhaps algebraic understanding must inevitably murder to dissect. The very method it employs making it impossible for it ever to grasp the essence of the phenomenon it addresses. It's at any rate important to keep in mind that the claim that there are some vocabularies, some discursive practices or abilities that are by their very nature not amenable to analytic algebraic reconstruction does not follow just from the observation that I made a minute ago in denying methodologically monistic scientism, namely that every analysis or algebraic reconstruction of a target vocabulary must make use of and so depend on the prior semantic determinateness and understanding of what's expressed by some base vocabulary. That is, it does not follow that there's some order of, as it were, natural basicness among vocabularies, which must have unexplained explainers. unexplained explainers. Base vocabularies that do not admit of analytic algebraic reconstruction in terms of others as its most basic elements. It might well be that although each analytic algebraic account of the use of any vocabulary must appeal to some base vocabulary whose use is not explicated in that account, still, every vocabulary that plays that role of base vocabulary in some analyses plays the role of target vocabulary in some other successful analysis. That is, a claim of the form, for all x there is a y such that rxy, doesn't entail one of the form, there is a y such that for all x rxy. I mean, as an example, it's true that the world has a population problem because during every minute there's a woman somewhere in the world having a baby. But it would not be a productive way to address the population problem by looking for the woman who's having all those babies and make her stop doing what she's doing. The sense in which algebraic understanding rests de jure on hermeneutic understanding may be of the local, for all x there is a y sort, not the global, there is a y such that for all x sort. The algebraic form of understanding requires distinguishing between base vocabularies and target vocabularies, between those employed in an account and those whose use is accounted for. But we can understand that distinction in at least two different ways. We can take it to be local and relative to particular expressive explanatory undertakings, on the one hand, or we can take it to be global and absolute on the other. That is, we can take it to be a matter of cognitive convenience or taste, or take it to be something we could get substantively wrong because of how things anyway are. That thought brings into view the notion of universal base vocabularies, and that in turn will bring us to the idea of metaphysics. What's distinctive of the programs of empiricism and naturalism, considered very abstractly, is that they each see some one vocabulary or vocabulary kind as uniquely privileged with respect to all other vocabularies. Empiricism takes its favorite vocabulary, whether it be phenomenal, secondary quality, or observational vocabulary, to be epistemologically privileged relative to all the rest. In what I think of as its most sophisticated forms, the privilege is understood more fundamentally to be semantic, and only derivatively and consequentially epistemological. Naturalism takes its favorite vocabulary, whether it be that of fundamental physics, the special sciences, or just the empirical descriptive, to be ontologically privileged relative to all the rest. In both cases, what motivates and gives weight and significance to the question of whether and to what extent and how a target vocabulary, let's say normative vocabulary, can be logically or algorithmically elaborated from the favorite base vocabulary, whether an empiricist or naturalist one, is whatever philosophical argument there is for epistemologically, semantically, or ontologically privileging the base vocabulary. These are arguments to the effect that everything that can be known, said, or thought, every fact, must be expressible in that base vocabulary. It's in this sense, epistemological, semantic, or ontological, a universal vocabulary. What it cannot express is fatally defective, unknowable, unintelligible, or unreal. One clear thing to mean by metaphysics is the making of claims of this sort about the universal expressive power of some vocabulary. Now, one might think that metaphysics in this sense is in principle a defective enterprise. I'm not really sure how arguments for such a claim at this level of generality go. I've heard four sorts, and I'm somewhat moved by a fifth. Empiricists rejected metaphysical claims because they want to make claims that there can be empirical evidence for, because they take that to be a necessary condition of those claims being candidates for expressing knowledge, or indeed meaning anything. Of course, that this methodological principle contradicted their own empiricist metaphysical principles, including this one, was forcefully pointed out by Hempel in his classic essay, The Empiricist Criterion of Cognitive Significance. Corresponding considerations, of course, show that someone who rejects empiricism on the grounds that it's unacceptably metaphysical can't offer these empiricist grounds for rejecting metaphysics. Naturalists often reject metaphysics on the ground that it's not a product of natural science. When we have real physics, why should we want, and how would we be justified in adding metaphysics? From this point of view, that would seem like the attempt to add an odious layer of hyperphysics. Or it's an attitude toward the results of science that is itself not science, but a kind of scientism that itself has no scientific credentials. Arthur Fine's rejection of scientific realism in favor of the natural ontological attitude is a sophisticated version of this thought. Again, though, someone who rejects naturalism as objectionable metaphysics can't do so for these naturalistic reasons. Pragmatists, such as Rorty, object to the privileging of some vocabularies as universal-based vocabularies, what's characteristic of metaphysics, on the grounds that it depends on a false, indeed ultimately magical, understanding of the nature of the sorts of privilege and authority that are involved. All normative statuses, including these, are, for pragmatists like him, instituted by social practice. There are no such normative statuses apart from our practical normative attitudes of taking or treating some things as privileged or authoritative. And for instrumentalist pragmatists like Rorty's hero Dewey, whom he sometimes follows in this respect, the ultimate source of those attitudes is our own needs, wants, and convenience. What's wrong with the metaphysical sort of privileging of vocabularies on this line is that it requires the idea of some vocabulary being necessarily privileged by how things are, that it be God's vocabulary, or nature's, or even mind's or meaning's vocabulary, quite apart from our contingent projects and attitudes. Once again, there would seem to be an issue about the self-referential stability of this view. Is the social nature of normativity and its normative capacity to trump metaphysical projects just a feature of the way things are anyway? Rorty's response is that this commitment, too, is indeed to be assessed relative to our needs, welfare, and projects. We learned from the Enlightenment, well, we were supposed to have learned this, though contemporary events may be dubious that we did, that it was bad for us in our development as mature humans in charge of our lives and institutions to understand moral normativity as simply reflecting how things were with a non-human, albeit divine, reality. And Rorty's practical proposal for a second enlightenment, completing the work of the first, is to extend that lesson of self-reliance from the practical to the theoretical sphere, for reasons analogous to those that warrant the first movement. This is radical and controversial. A more Wittgensteinian pragmatism addresses metaphysical programs more in a retail than a wholesale spirit. It addresses empiricism and naturalism and any successor projects one by one, seeking to undermine the specific claims of privilege that they put forward. Here, the various criticisms Sellers addresses to empiricism, adverted to in my opening lecture, as well as those of Quine and Austin, concern as paradigms of this sort of local criticism. But it also expresses a more general suspicion that any such program, metaphysical program, will turn out upon examination to have been motivated by a philosophical anxiety that can be traced to some relatively specific, misleading philosophical picture of what knowledge, mind, meaning, or reality must be like on pain of some bad consequence. The best anti-metaphysical strategy is then to diagnose and dissolve that underlying misconception, thereby relieving the felt pressure that had made a metaphysical response seem possible because necessary. McDowell reads Kant and Hegel as already engaged in enterprises with this diagnostic therapeutical, anti-metaphysical shape. As far as the general issue is concerned, I think this is an anti-metaphysical attitude and perhaps a template for arguing against metaphysical programs rather than an anti-metaphysical argument itself. What most gives me pause about the commitments underlying programs of the sort I'm calling metaphysical is that they essentially require us to quantify over all possible vocabularies. Universal-based languages are base languages from which every vocabulary that is legitimate in some sense, specific to the metaphysical program, can be elaborated as a target vocabulary. And I have my doubts about that notion. It's not that I'm confident that that no sense can be made of the notion of all possible vocabularies. It's rather that I think it doesn't come with a clear sense. If it's to make sense, we have to give it a sense, and I don't know how to do that. As a graduate student, I attended a seminar offered by the great anthropologist Clifford Geertz. In the first session, in the course of defining culture, the topic of anthropology, he defined a language as, quote, a symbol system in which everything can be said. In a question, I expressed my natural curiosity as to what he meant by everything. He declined further comment, wisely perhaps, but I'd still like to know what one might mean by it. The worry is that no definite or determinate totality is being delineated. Maybe new vocabularies become possible all the time. This issue arises equally and for the same reason if we talk of all possible facts. Following Frege, I understand facts as true thoughts, in the sense of true thinkables rather than true thinkings, of course. And I understand what's thinkable to be what's claimable, what's sayable, what's expressible inside vocabulary. So, there are as many facts as there are true statements in any vocabulary. I mean, parenthetically, I don't object to people using facts differently, for instance, so as to allow for the possibility of facts not expressible in any vocabulary. I've said what I mean by fact. But if they do, they have to undertake the labor of making sense of that more capacious notion, saying what they mean by fact in a way that swings free of its expressibility. And they need to show that there's some real work for such a conception to do. But that means that talking about all the facts and talking about all possible vocabularies involve a common set of commitments. And those are commitments about which I'm uneasy. And I should say I'm equally uncomfortable with quantification over all objects. Objects are to sortals as facts are to claims. All of them depend on what possible vocabularies there are. One might think in this connection of the third proposition of the Tractatus. The world is determined by the facts and by there being all the facts. That's 1.11. Wittgenstein rejects the idea of facts that cannot be expressed. For any fact, there's some vocabulary in which it can be stated, and stated clearly. To talk about all the facts is then to talk about everything expressible in any vocabulary. The Tractatus is predicated on there being some one vocabulary in which everything sayable at all can be said. It is in this sense a work of metaphysics. And the claim I cited, the world is determined by the facts and by there being all the facts, is a metaphysical claim. But nothing but embarrassment results if we ask about the official status of the second conjunct of this proposition in the botanization of the Tractatus, by there being all the facts. That a specified collection of facts is all the facts is not itself one of those facts, nor a fact of that kind. But facts are what can be said. Wittgenstein officially denies that we can even say that there are facts, or how many there are of them. But then, is that the world is determined by the facts and there being all the facts something that's shown? But how would you show that? The awkwardness here shows how the issue of the intelligibility of quantifying over all vocabularies arises in the particular setting of the Tractatus. The cognate difficulties attend claims such as all the facts are physical facts. Putting aside worries about the boundaries of physical facts, after all, it's a very implausible claim if one means contemporary physics, and it's hard to say what one means by something like conventional or ideal physics in a way that remains plausible without circularity. But put those issues to one side, and issues about the sense of R, the sense of in which we're saying that all facts are physical facts. Still, the question of how to give a definite sense to all the facts in such a way as to make the claim plausible without being question-begging remains. I just don't know what we're saying when we talk this way. The main point I want to make is that one need not endorse any commitment to locally privileging some vocabularies as base vocabularies with respect to all vocabularies, which are then taken to be legitimate in one sense or another, only if, and insofar as they can be reconstructed as target vocabularies elaborated from those base vocabularies, in order to vindicate the project of locally identifying particular cases in which the base vocabulary-target vocabulary relation can be shown to obtain. For there's a distinctive kind of philosophical understanding that consists in practical mastery of the relations among vocabularies that become visible when we trace various possible base-to-target relations through the admittedly in general ill-defined field of all vocabularies. As an example, functionalism, and specifically computational AI species, is an attempted local privileging of one vocabulary over another, of functional vocabulary over intentional vocabulary. It has no pretensions at all to global privileging of functional vocabulary. It doesn't claim that it's a universal base vocabulary. Though elsewhere I've offered some reasons for skepticism about even the most plausible, pragmatist versions of AI functionalism about intentionality, I think that a suitably broadly construed functionalism is something like the only straw floating as a prospect for an account, in other terms, of intentionality. Of course, it may well be, as some Wittgensteinians, for instance, think, that intentional discourse can only be understood in its own terms, and not in terms of some other vocabulary. For reasons I've discussed, that would not mean that understanding would totter. Analytic, algorithmic, algebraic understanding is not the only kind of genuine philosophic understanding, and it's just not always available. My teacher, David Lewis, propounded a view of philosophy that was inspiring to me when I was a student, and that inspires me still. He thought that what philosophers should do is lay down a set of premises concerning some topic of interest as clearly as possible, and extract consequences from them as rigorously as possible. Having done that, one should then lay down another, perhaps quite different set of premises, and extract consequences from them as rigorously as possible. The point was not, in the first instance, to endorse the conclusions of any of these chains of reasoning, but rather to learn our way about in the inferential field they all defined, by tracing many overlapping, intersecting, and diverging paths through the terrain. That's how we would learn what difference it would make in various contexts if we were to endorse some claim that figures as a premise in many of the inferences, and what might entitle us to a claim that shows up as a consequence in many of the inferences. Actually plumping for, endorsing, and defending any of these theses is a subsequent, parasitic, and substantially less important stage of the process. The principal aim of philosophy, Lewis thought, is not belief, but understanding. Well, he got crotchetier about that in his old age when he got more systematic in his thinking. One thing that was liberating and exhilarating about this metaphilosophical attitude is that Lewis accordingly didn't care much what reasons one had for starting with one set of premises rather than another. He was entirely open to, and indeed eager to turn his awe-inspiring intellect to following out the consequences of even the wackiest of claims. Hubble Tiki visited while I was still in graduate school at Princeton, and he was then gripped by just such an obsession. He'd somehow gotten the idea that there was some finite number of n, such that it was a necessary truth that there were exactly n things in each possible world, and that there were no further constraints on trans-world identification of objects or counterparts. So, for instance, he was willing to contemplate a possible world in which I was a hard-boiled egg, but not one in which I was two hard-boiled eggs. I don't know how Hubble thought he could count objects, and I can't imagine what would make one think his axiom was true. But Lewis was perfectly willing to figure out what sort of modal logic and indeed metaphysics one would get on that assumption. You just never know where you might learn something. I think this is the spirit in which we should think about semantic relations between different vocabularies. It's worth seeing how and to what extent different target vocabularies can be elaborated from different base vocabularies, including and perhaps especially with pragmatic detours through the specifications of practices or abilities necessary or sufficient to deploy those vocabularies, as I recommended between saying and doing. Because this is a way of coming to practically know our way around those vocabularies, our discursive practices, and the subject matters that make it possible for us to talk and think about. Exploring all the available paths between landmarks is a way, perhaps the only way, of learning to find our way around in these woods, acquiring a practical conceptual mastery of the many aspects of discursive practice and their relations to one another. Let me repeat that I'm not claiming this is all there is to philosophy, or that this is the only way to do philosophy. But this sort of semantic analysis yields one valuable kind of understanding that is potentially of great philosophical value. And notice that on this view, One's exploration of semantic relations, including pragmatically mediated ones among vocabularies of antecedent philosophical interest, need not be motivated by some global monolithic program, such as empiricism or naturalism. The distinctive kind of semantic understanding I'm suggesting is the genus of which metaphysical understanding as a species is not hostage to such programs. That understanding can be well served by accumulating particular local connections that support no antecedent global program and perhaps could be predicted by none. Nor must the search for such semantic relations among vocabularies and the discursive practices or abilities they specify or that deploy them be motivated by some deep-seated philosophical anxiety or puzzlement, the proper deflating diagnosis of which then exhibits or renders the task of exploring those relations odious. Simple curiosity, the desire to deepen our understanding, can suffice for this sort of philosophical theorizing as it can for the empirical scientific variety. Indeed, as Kuhn taught us in the latter case, it really doesn't matter why the scientists do what they do, since the institution can ensure that so long as they act professionally, the result will be to extend our knowledge and deepen our understanding. So we may strive to make it be in philosophy. With this thought on the table, I want to return briefly to the issue of metaphysics. Taking our cue from Geertz, we might think of metaphysics as the enterprise of crafting a vocabulary in which everything can be said. Now, he might be right that, in the sense I'm after, natural languages are autonomous vocabularies in which everything can be said. But the word craft is doing some work in the definition I suggested. The metaphysician aims to construct a technical, artificial vocabulary with that same expressive power. Why? The greater control that regimentation gives vocabularies whose basic semantics is stipulated in some other vocabulary, perhaps a natural language, there is no escaping the need for hermeneutic understanding, and the rest of whose semantics is computed algorithmically. For we have a distinctively clear sort of understanding of what other vocabularies can be elaborated as target vocabularies from a base vocabulary constructed so as to exhibit this structure. We can get around my earlier worries about the concept of all possible vocabularies by understanding the everything regulatively rather than constitutively. That is, for every vocabulary anyone comes up with, the metaphysician is committed to the favored base vocabulary being adequate when suitably elaborated to express what it expresses. We can start by trying to codify the vocabularies we have, but also acknowledge the commitment to address any more that may come along. I think metaphysics in this sense is a perfectly reasonable undertaking, and that we potentially have a lot to learn from pursuing it. It is perhaps somewhat quixotic, but that's a practical, not a theoretical drawback. If we're to reap the rewards and understanding of engaging in this kind of metaphysical enterprise promises, however, I think it's crucial that it be pursued in the open-minded, pluralistic spirit of Lewis, and not in a more small-minded and exclusionary one. The distinction arises when the metaphysician fails to construct, in the favored terms, all the antecedent uses of all the vocabularies it aspires to codify. I take it that such partial failures are inevitable. The task is just too hard, both for practical reasons and for principled ones. It's probably too much to ask that for every target vocabulary, one finds some other regimented base vocabulary from which it can be elaborated. And finding some one regimented base vocabulary in terms of which every such target vocabulary can be reconstructed is far more difficult and unlikely. That's why it is to some extent a quixotic quest. But for the same sort of reason that led to Popper's methodological recommendation in empirical science to endorse the strongest, most easily falsifiable theory not already falsified by the evidence you've got, it can make sense to pursue the quantification of a more difficult goal. For, to the limited extent that one does succeed, one finds out more both about the metaphysical base vocabulary and about the target vocabularies to which it turns out either to be expressively adequate or not to be expressively adequate. Traditional metaphysics treats that distinction as invidious. It denigrates and dismisses what resists formulation in its favorite terms as ontologically second class, as unreal, as mere appearance. So, for Leibniz, relations and evil are unreal, relegated to the phenomenal realm of appearance. And later metaphysicians found themselves similarly rejecting as unreal such phenomena as time. One of my favorite metaphysical mind-benders is the attempt of some of the British idealists to dismiss finitude as an illusion, the effect produced by the infinite absolute, what there really is, on poor, incapable, merely finite minds. In a more contemporary semantic key, the term of disapprobation may be unintelligible rather than the ontological unreal. That, at any rate, is the way the logical empiricists taught, and admirers of theirs such as Klein continued the practice. For him, modal logic, as he said, merely engenders an illusion of understanding, and intentional vocabulary is merely apparently coherent. 19th century idealism, which more or less equates the unreal with the unintelligible, may be thought of in this respect as a transitional phrase from metaphysicians saying the bad stuff is unreal to saying it's unintelligible. But such a mean-spirited, suspicious, begrudging, and exclusionary attitude is not the only one possible. One might instead take the great positive payoff of a particular metaphysical effort to consist in no small part in the particular line it draws between what target vocabularies, and which bits of each, can and which cannot be captured with the expressive resources of the base vocabulary, whose metaphysical credentials are being explored. Each regimented base vocabulary, we might suppose, will determine a different boundary between the relatively expressible and inexpressible. Suppose we found out, it wouldn't surprise me, that there is simply no way to say in the language of fundamental physics, no matter how it's elaborated with the resources of the most advanced logic, what Beckett said when he said, "I can't go on, I'll go on." Or what Nixon said when he said, "I'm not a crook." Or what the Buddha said when he told the hot dog man, "Make me one with everything." Or, well, we don't need to say that they didn't say anything, or pretend that we can't understand what they did say. We don't need to deny that there is such a thing as going on, being a crook, and so on, to learn something about saying things from the relation between their vocabularies and that of fundamental physics that show up in this expressive mismatch. Indeed, I think we learn more if we do not go on to adopt the wholly optional dismissive attitude. Our slogan should be metaphysical discrimination without denigration. And just as Lewis thought it essential that we draw consequences rigorously from many sets of premises, so as to learn our way around by taking many different paths through the terrain, so the virtues of the metaphysical enterprise will manifest themselves most fully if we try out many different possible metaphysical base vocabularies. A side benefit of adopting this plan would be that then we need not resign ourselves to living out our philosophical lives impressed by the steady drip, drip, drip of naturalistic semantics and ontology. My characterization of metaphysics transposes what's normally thought of in ontological terms into a semantic key. These versions can be thought of as related to one another on the model of Carnap's material and formal modes. I have described the metaphysical project in metalinguistic terms. It might seem that the translation back and forth between these two ways of talking is so straightforward that it's perverse to file ordinary philosophical usage by insisting on the metalinguistic version here. But in this case, there's a significant asymmetry between them. Indeed, I think the asymmetry here reveals something important about the Carnapian dyad that we might otherwise not have seen, a new justification from the side of pragmatism for the characteristically analytic preference for the formal mode. For thinking of the metaphysical enterprise in semantic terms, as seeking to establish distinctive sorts of relations among vocabularies, opens up the possibility of considering in this case, too, pragmatically mediated semantic relations between vocabularies, in addition to the traditional kind. In particular, we can lay alongside the aspiration to find a vocabulary in which everything can be said, the aspiration to find a vocabulary in which one can say everything one must do in order to say anything. That is, to use any vocabulary, whatever. This is just the idea of a universal pragmatic metavocabulary.
The sort of illumination one would get from succeeding at the task of constructing a regimented, de facto universal pragmatic metavocabulary is not exactly the same as what one would get from succeeding at the task of constructing a regimented vocabulary whose expressive power encompassed that of all the vocabularies we come up with to try it out on. But they would evidently be complementary forms of understanding, one telling us what we can say, and the other telling us what we must do to say it. Further, any adequate pragmatic metavocabulary for a semantically adequate metaphysical vocabulary would be a universal pragmatic metavocabulary, just by transitivity. I've already suggested, however, that I think the real payoff from the metaphysical enterprise should not be thought of as consequent on the anticipation of complete success at producing a regimented, semantically expressive universal vocabulary. In place of such wholesale cognitive reward, we should think of the accumulation of retail rewards. Each only partially successful try at a universal metaphysical vocabulary draws a line between those antecedent vocabularies it can reconstruct and those it cannot. And each such endeavor will draw a different line. The lesson I drew from the young David Lewis's methodologically principled polymorphous theoretical promiscuity is that a valuable kind of understanding consists in the sort of knowing our way about that's secured only by multiplying the crisscrossing of concrete ways of drawing the boundary between the expressible and the inexpressible, not globally and absolutely, but locally and relative to specific base vocabularies. The same will hold true of attempts to construct regimented universal pragmatic metavocabularies. Their value lies in the details of their only partial successes, in where specifically they fail, and in how the line between partial success and partial failure varies as we try out quite different candidate base vocabularies. Here one thinks of the parable with which Hempel closes the empiricist criteria of cognitive significance, in which a dying father tells his sons that a vast treasure is buried in their vineyard. Only many years later do they realize that their energetic but fruitless digging in search of the imaginary trove has led to their turning over the soil in just the way needed to ensure that their vines flourish. The romantic dream of total transformation by a single magical find inspires the hard, unexciting daily work that gradually lays up the real treasure. The parallel between the metaphysical goal of crafting a regimented, universally expressive vocabulary and that of constructing a universal pragmatic metavocabulary, the genus of which these two tasks are species, is invisible if we think of metaphysics exclusively in ontological terms. The wider perspective is available only if we construe it semantically, in terms of relations between vocabularies. And so viewed, those two enterprises show up as complementary, corresponding to elements not only of the dimension defined by the semantic pragmatic distinction, but also of the objective-subjective dimension, what's talked about and the talking about it. They address objective ontological and subjective practical sides of the coin of discursiveness. Although both of these sorts of totalizing project come into view from the vantage point of the meaning-use analysis, what I'm doing in between saying and doing is neither metaphysics nor an attempt to construct a universal pragmatic metavocabulary. Rather, I'm looking for a different kind of metavocabulary. It's at a higher level, making it possible to express crucial structural features of the relations between the dimensions of discursiveness that they take as their targets, relations between what's said and what's done. But out of that project grows both a new way of thinking about the project of metaphysics and about the possibility of a new, pragmatic kind of universal metavocabulary. Perhaps the availability of this new chart in the Metaphilosophical Atlas will yield other worthwhile dividends as well.